Good morning. Welcome to the dissertation defense of Steve Schilhabel. It is an honor and a proud privilege to introduce Steve today. He's the Director of Infrastructure Services in the IT department at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. He's also a lecturer there, teaching some courses for the IT department there. He's worked in leadership roles in several organizations, including Secura Insurance, Thrivent Financial, Integris Energy Group, etc. He's worked on program development, IT modernization, automation, and a variety of other roles. So anybody who has interacted with Steve, you know that he's very passionate about blockchain and cryptocurrency, and his dissertation is a reflection of his passion. It's on blockchain adoption. So he's joined here today by his wife, Amy. Welcome, Amy, to Whitewater. So without further ado, please welcome Steve.
Thank you, Balaji. I wanted to start by thanking everybody, starting with my wife, Amy, who's really put up with me for the last 3 years. Well, I've worked full-time and pursued the doctorate, as well as my committee, Balaji, Addy, and Andy, who are here today, and the leader of the program, Praveen. So thank you very much for the opportunity today. As Balaji mentioned, I'm going to talk about blockchain technology, specifically blockchain technology adoption in medium and large-sized companies. For the agenda today, we're going to do a little bit of an introduction into the topic. I'll explain the motivation behind it, why I came up with this, a little bit of background on what blockchain technology is, the research problem, the research question. Then I have a 2-chapter or 2-essay dissertation. I'll talk about each one of those chapters. The first chapter being a systematic literature review, which led to the development of a research framework. The second chapter being some quantitative analysis, in which I did a mixed methods approach. We'll wrap up with a discussion, limitations, and questions and answers. So the research motivation. When I first started, as Balaji mentioned, this was a passion of mine. I actually invested in Bitcoin and made some profits in the second halvening event for blockchain. I used those profits to actually pay for the doctorate program here at UW-Whitewater. So I figured once I started, that was my research interest, that's what I should be researching, talking about. Within that, I immediately started to look for scholarly research or peer-reviewed articles relative to blockchain technology. The first thing I noticed was that there were a lot of articles that discussed the potential innovative nature of blockchain, that it could be a very disruptive technology. However, I was also, as Balaji mentioned, a practitioner. I spent 30 years working at 3 different organizations. And as I talked to leaders and decision makers in those organizations, I got a very different response from them. None of them were interested in blockchain. In fact, they had a very negative response when I brought up the topic. They said, "Isn't that used for Bitcoin? We don't want anything to do with that." So my research motivation and what I think is interesting about this research is understanding that disconnect between the published scholarly research and what I was experiencing as a practitioner. Before I get too far into it, I at least want to spend a few minutes talking about blockchain technology, what it is, at least at a 50,000 foot level so that everybody understands it and has some background. I would define blockchain technology as being a distributed ledger, and I think it helps to understand that best by comparing it to a centralized ledger. Everybody probably here has some type of a financial institution they go to. They probably have a checking account. That checking account represents a centralized ledger. And what I mean by that is the bank or the credit union, the financial institution involved, they are the ones that make the decisions on when a record gets added, when a record gets deleted, when a record gets changed. Blockchain technology is a decentralized ledger. In essence, what happens is there's a copy of the entire blockchain, and that's distributed onto multiple different servers for multiple different users. Those users each have what's called a node, and together they work to decide when a record gets added to the blockchain. There are 4 key characteristics then that go on to define blockchain after you understand that it's a distributed ledger. The first is the immutable nature of it. When a block gets added to the record, when a record gets added to the block, it's never deleted. You just keep sequentially adding records to it. And the records are grouped into a block, thus the term blockchain. And there's a number used only once that's calculated for that block based on the content of the block. So if anybody were to hack into the blockchain, change that record, the number calculated only once would change, and everybody on the blockchain would immediately be aware that the record or the block had been altered. There are 3 other key characteristics that help define blockchain technology or are unique to it. The next one is the consensus mechanism. I mentioned this a few minutes earlier. In essence, everybody that has a copy of the blockchain contributes to deciding what gets added to the block or the chain. This is called a consensus mechanism. It's, again, the opposite of approach of that centralized ledger where the bank is the central authority that decides what gets put on it. The last 2 key characteristics are cryptography and transparency. Cryptography is pretty straightforward. Everything on the blockchain is encrypted, and we're generally all aware at this point what encryption is. Transparency is another distinction with a centralized ledger. If you think about your bank account or your financial records, only the bank and you generally have access to your records. With blockchain, everybody can see the records or the blockchain itself. There are 2 main types of blockchains. There's a public blockchain and a private blockchain. In a public blockchain, it's truly available for everybody to see. In a private blockchain, it's generally only available for the people who are contributing to the blockchain, the people who have servers or nodes related to it. Research problem. So when I first started looking at this, I looked into the disruptive technologies and support networks from Bauer and Christensen. This helps explain how new or innovative technologies come along and disrupt marketplaces. And I think it helps best to talk about this in terms of an example. Most of the people in the room probably have a smartphone, probably have it in your pocket, and maybe an iPhone. Those are very popular. A lot of people think about iPhones as being the first smartphone, but if we really think back, it wasn't the first smartphone. The first smartphone on the market was usually the BlackBerry. Most people remember that. It was used extensively with business users, people who wanted to access their email for work when they were outside of work and they didn't have a computer available. It had physical buttons and a very small screen. Very popular among business users, but it wasn't popular among the general public. It hadn't achieved acceptance with the mainstream customers until Apple came along and they changed the design. They made the screen the full size of the phone. They got rid of the physical buttons and they used a touch screen for the entry. This is what got to acceptance or reached acceptance with the mainstream market, and the smartphone industry really took off from there. Research gaps and questions. As I started to do the research, 2 things became apparent to me. The first was, as I was looking for other research on why companies adopt or choose not to adopt blockchain technology, I wasn't able to find anything. There was no research framework out there about adoption for blockchain technology. In fact, there was very little, there were really no research frameworks for blockchain technology, which also feeds into the second one. I also became aware that there were very few quantitative studies relative to blockchain technologies. Lots of published papers, but they were all qualitative in nature. Generally, case studies, they went something like this. Small startup A went ahead and implemented blockchain for this new and novel use case. And then the next paper would be a case study. Small company B came along, implemented a new use case for blockchain this way. And then it led into another series of papers that were industry specific. Finance companies are starting to use blockchain for this. Supply chain companies are starting to use blockchain for this, but nothing from a quantitative perspective, or very little from a quantitative perspective. So, first chapter, as I mentioned earlier, this was a systematic literature review, which led to the development of a research framework. Just want to stop and pause on this slide. I took a very methodical approach to the systematic literature review. The first thing I did was develop a research framework based on my experience as a practitioner. So I identified all the independent and dependent variables that I was aware of. I then went ahead and researched and found the top 20 most cited articles on the topic. From this, I fed them into a tool called MaxQDA. Certainly, you don't need to use a tool to complete a systematic literature review, but I really felt like MaxQDA did 2 things for me. It made it far more efficient, and I felt the results were more reliable. I felt more confident in what I was doing with the use of the tool. One of the things it allowed me to do right away was do a keyword count. And I was able to find the most commonly used keywords in those top 20 articles. I bumped those up against the research framework that I had developed and looked for the differences. Once I'd done that, I'd found the next grouping of most used or most cited articles on the topic. I did the Web of Science and I identified the next 25. I imported those into MaxQDA, and then I did keyword searches on everything I'd found from the first 20 articles. Then I looked at the sentences preceding and following each one, and this allowed me to do a deeper dive on the variables. In particular, I was able to take the unobservable variables and use the words around them to define the observable variables, how the researchers were defining those characteristics or those terms. Once that was all done, I refined the research framework. This is an example of an output from MaxQDA. One of the nice things that it allows you to do is take all your work and export it into Excel. This is an example of one record and how it came out. So in the Excel, I was able to export a row or a record for each one of the 45 articles that I'd looked at. And these were the characteristics that I captured for each one of them. The author, the year, the journal it was in, the theories that they used, the constructs that they used, their design, their method, and then I captured some notes which I embedded into MaxQDA on how it related back to my research. Just a quick picture of MaxQDA. It's a screenshot. It's not from mine. It's a standard one. However, I wanted to show it because it was so instrumental in this phase of the research. As I mentioned, you're allowed to input documents, both Word and PDF. It automatically searches for keywords or words in general and gives you the word counts. And then you can do searches, you can insert memos, take notes, and then you can export those things into Word maps and other documents like the Excel spreadsheet I utilized. This is the research framework that I had developed at the conclusion of Essay 1 or Chapter 1, the Systematic Literature Review. You can see it talks about some of the constructs we already mentioned. Along the left-hand side, you're going to see 4 drivers. Those are the 4 that we mentioned earlier: the distributed nature, cryptography, immutability, and consensus mechanism. Along the second column, I broke up barriers, things that I envisioned would negatively impact the dependent variable. At this point, I was talking about 2 major categories: behavioral barriers, which were barriers from human beings, decisions they made, biases they might have, and technical barriers. I would say an example of a technical barrier could be storage. We talked earlier about blockchain never deleting or removing records. So you can imagine as records are added, it just keeps growing and growing. So at this time, I posited that storage may be a technical barrier to organizations wanting to adopt blockchain technology. The third column, I have the decision. In this case, it was intent to adopt or organizational intent to adopt. And along the right-hand side, I had the results of adoption. That would be adoption itself and then the actual results. Earlier, I mentioned I utilized the antecedents, decisions, and outcomes model, and you can see that broken out here. The right 2 columns are the decisions and outcomes. The only difference is that I took the antecedents and I broke them out into drivers and barriers, what was positively influencing and what was negatively influencing it. This resulted in another export that I was able to calculate or create in Excel from MaxQDA. What I was able to do is take all of those constructs and break them down. So you can see in this example, it starts, and that's not working, that's okay. Level 1 would be the antecedents or the drivers we just talked about. One of those drivers was the distributed nature of blockchain technology. That would be an unobservable variable. You can't measure the distributed nature of it. However, with MaxQDA, I was able to identify the measurable variables around it. In this case, for this record, I found 3: transparency, decentralization, and auditability. So the research articles were talking in terms like that, but what they were really talking about was the distributed nature of blockchain technology. I was also then able to go through all of those articles and find the most common definitions of those. I used those definitions to develop my measures for the survey itself. That brings us to chapter 2, or essay 2. This leads into really addressing the second research question that I had, or the research gap that I noted, and that was the lack of quantitative studies. For this chapter, I took a mixed method approach. I started with some case interviews, I did some regression analysis, and then I utilized a method called fuzzy set qualitative content analysis. Before I get into it, I wanted to introduce a new construct that I introduced at this time. This really goes back to my experience as a practitioner. So I had all these articles that talked about blockchain is going to be a disruptive technology. It's going to be very innovative. But when I would talk to decision makers, leaders in organizations, they didn't really want anything to do with it. So I did note in the second bullet chain, the bullet point, all of the articles or scholarly articles that I talked about, and in particular, when they started to talk about negative connotations to cryptocurrencies. There were really 3 points that happened around cryptocurrency. They talked about the price volatility, and everybody's aware of that as it's in the public. You see the price going spike up, the price spike up, spike down, changes rapidly and goes through huge swings. If I talk to finance people within the organization, finance leaders, they talked about that a lot. Other leaders commonly talked about the other 2 things, criminal activity. Cryptocurrencies are deeply associated with criminal activity. When you talk about the dark web, when you talk about the old Silk Road, when goods and services, illegal goods and services were being sold and traded, they were commonly paid for with cryptocurrencies. They were paid for with cryptocurrencies because it's anonymous. The records are visible, but there's nothing that identifies the person or the organization behind the transaction itself. So criminals used it quite a lot early on. Then finally, regulatory ambiguity. People in the legal departments would commonly refer to this. And this is really a function of blockchain being a new technology. So simply stated, the government hasn't caught up to it. The lawmakers haven't made decisions about what to do with it. So that's a little bit about the bias, but on the other end, what I connected that to was the fact that people are associating cryptocurrencies with blockchain technology itself. This is really because the first utilization of blockchain technology, it was created for a cryptocurrency, it was created for Bitcoin. And the way I like to think about this was a vacation I took when I was first married. We went to Tennessee to visit one of my wife's sisters. We were in a restaurant, we were having a conversation. I had ordered a Coke, or a Diet Coke, and the server said, sure, what kind of Coke do you want? Do you want a Dr. Pepper? Do you want a Sprite? Do you want a 7-Up? Coke had reached a point in Tennessee where it was synonymous with soda in general. In the same way, because blockchain was the first use of cryptocurrencies, they've become synonymous. So I hypothesized, or I posited it at this point, that there was a negative bias against blockchain associated with the negative bias that was related to cryptocurrencies. Next couple slides, I want to talk about the 3 main theories that I utilized in the research. The first is affordance actualization theory by Gibson. This is a psychological theory. What I really want to do is understand why some of the antecedents would positively impact the intent to adopt. In this case, it's a psychological theory. Again, I think it helps to understand it with an example. So basically, Gibson is saying that the value of an item, it goes beyond the physical properties of it. So if you imagine an animal in a forest or in a jungle and they see a rock, the rock can provide more value to them than just the physical properties of that rock. They could pick it up and they could use it to defend themselves. They could attack another animal. They could use it as a weapon. If they had a nut, they could use it to smash the nut and get to the high protein inside the nut. Same way the 4 drivers that we talked about can have a positive intent or impact on an organization's intent to adopt blockchain. If they have a use case where the consensus mechanism is highly important, blockchain provides an affordance for that. The second theory I used was innovation diffusion theory by Rogers. A lot of you might be thinking, why didn't I just use user acceptance? That's a very, very popular one. The difference was that I was interested in organizational intent to adopt. The user acceptance model, the unit of measure is really individual. So I needed to rely on the innovation diffusion theory. Basically, this talks about adoption of technologies in organizations through 5 stages. The first, they have to become aware of it. The second, they go through a stage of persuasion. This could occur internally by employees arguing for it or advocating for it, or customers demanding it. Then moves on to a decision. In our case, this would be organizational intent to adopt. Then there's an implementation phase. This implementation phase could take the form of a proof of concept or a pilot. Then there's a 5th stage, which is a confirmation of that and either a decision to continue on using it or to discontinue its use. The other theory I mentioned earlier was the Disruptive Technologies and Support Network by Bauer and Christensen. And the key thing that I wanted to mention at this point is blockchain technology has not yet achieved acceptance. And this is one of the core things I was trying to understand with this research. What's preventing or what needs to happen from a positive perspective to lead a more mainstream adoption of this technology? As I mentioned earlier, I took a mixed method approach. I did 3 specific things. I started with structured interviews. I then did some regression analysis with partial least squares, and then I finished up with fuzzy set qualitative analysis. Together, these 3 methods provided to me a high degree of reliability in the results I found. Structured interviews. So I started by identifying 2 startups that were utilizing blockchain. They developed business models specifically around blockchain technologies. I sat down with each of them twice, and then I followed up with some emails to ask some additional questions. Some key themes emerged during those conversations. The first, both of those organizations talked a lot about interoperability. And what I mean by this, and they didn't say interoperability, but I bundled it to this. What they meant was, one of their concerns was being able to share information from one blockchain to another. Blockchain is an open source technology. The creators of it put the code out there. Anybody can take the code, they can modify the code, they can change the code. This is great from a programmer perspective. We love this. So what immediately happened is other people came along, they took the code, and they created new cryptocurrencies. And then other people took the code and they developed new use cases for the technology. In particular, a popular one is smart contracts. So you can embed the details of a contract in there, and when certain events happen, you can automatically launch the next part of the event. This is very popular in supply chain. You can write a contract, the goods arrive at an organization, they're on a dock, they scan it in, and immediately the payment can go forward. The next thing they talked about were the differences between large organizations and small organizations. As startups, they weren't encumbered. They could take a new technology and they could play with it, do different things with it, find out the use of it. They talked about how large organizations are much slower to adopt or look at new technology. They need a business case for it. They need something that's going to generate a profit for it right away. They're not as active in pursuing new technologies. The final thing that I caught from the 2 interviews was the connection to Web 3.0. They didn't come out and say Web 3.0, but this is really what they were talking about. A little bit of background on that. Web 1.0 is really the first iteration of the World Wide Web or the internet. This is where static content was put out, and consumers basically read information. Web 0.20 is considered the phase we're in right now. This is where you have input and output on the internet. So this is basically e-commerce. I can go to Amazon.com, I can see their inventory, I can put in my credit card information, I can go to a shopping cart, I can make a purchase, and then they send that to me. Web 3.0 doesn't have a common definition yet, but there are some technologies that researchers are envisioning will form the 3rd iteration of the web. There are people that talk about how it's going to be very individualized. So if 3 people go to the same web page, the content that they see will each be different based on their characteristics. The second thing that's commonly associated with Web 3.0 is artificial intelligence. We're seeing that a lot today in terms of chatbots, in terms of ChatGPT and other technologies. The third and final component that's commonly talked about with Web 3.0 is blockchain technology, both in terms of being able to pay for goods and services and also track some of those characteristics within the blockchain that will allow for that individualization of those web pages to individual consumers. At this point, based on those conversations, I redefined or updated the research framework one more time. In particular, I reduced the barriers down to 1, and I reduced it down to the cryptocurrency bias 1. The reason I did this is in talking to the two individuals, they didn't talk about technical barriers at all. They had felt like from their perspective, they had solved or found ways to work around all the technical barriers. So it didn't seem prudent to me to spend a lot of time investigating the other barriers. The next method I used was regression analysis, in particular partial least squares. I want to stop and pause on this slide. It's an important slide. You will recognize the constructs from the research framework, but this really lays out the research model that I went into, the way I defined my survey, what I was collecting information on, what my hypotheses were. So along the left-hand side, you see 4 independent variables. These were the initial drivers that we talked about: the distributed ledger, the cryptography, immutability, and the consensus mechanism. Those were all having, or I'm positing at this point, would have a positive impact on managerial intent to adopt blockchain technology. Then I had the one barrier, and I formulated it in 2 different ways because I wasn't sure how it was affecting it. I posited at this point that it might have 2 different effects. First, it may have a direct impact on managerial intent to adopt. So if I go back to my example of the chief financial officer, he associates blockchain with cryptocurrencies. He might immediately say, no, I'm not going to touch this. I don't want anything to do with this in my organization. On the other hand, people who were maybe in leadership roles might have a need for some of the drivers, but they might have a cryptocurrency bias, which would negatively moderate the positive impact of those drivers on managerial intent to adopt. My last 2 hypotheses led into the 2 dependent variables. At this point, I talked about the extent of use and organizational benefits. In particular, I want to pause on the extent of use and talk about that a little bit. This one came from my practitioner experience. Generally, when we implement a new technology, we start with a proof of concept, then maybe a pilot for the first production event. And then if that's successful, we do checkpoints along the way. If it's successful, then we expand it to other use cases and grow it. So I was positing at this point that we'd achieve managerial intent to use. It would start off small, it would grow, and as it would grow, the benefits to the organization would also increase. So this was the research model that I utilized for the regression analysis. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide, but what I want to point out is that I followed a very methodical approach for the regression analysis. I followed all the standard things that you do with regression analysis. I took that from the textbooks we'd read, and I'm going to move on to the next slide where I lay out the results of some of that analysis, and then on the following slide, the overall results of the regression analysis. So there are a couple things you always look at when you do regression analysis. The first thing I looked at was Cronbach's alpha. This is a measure of internal consistency. The threshold for this is 0.7. The lowest value that I found was 0.947. So from this perspective, I was able to establish reliability. The next thing I looked at was the AVE, or the average variance extracted. The threshold here is to be greater than 0.50. My lowest value was 0.69. This established convergent validity for me. The next 3 are all tests of discriminant validity. The first was Fornell-Walker. You look at the root of the AVI, AVE, and you compare it to the other constructs. Everything here met the minimum thresholds. The second was the cross-loadings. What you're really looking for here is those observable variables loading to their parent construct higher than any of the other constructs. This was true in all the cases. The third and final test of discriminant validity was HTMT. This is a more advanced test of discriminant validity. You're looking for an HTMT below 0.90. All my constructs were below this, with one exception, and that was cryptocurrency bias, which was right around that mark. To me, this points to the fact that cryptocurrency bias is a new construct and it requires more research. We need to understand it better. The next one was the VIF, or the variance inflation factor. This identifies multi-collinearity. In this case, all my constructs passed this, with the exception of 3 that were right around the threshold at 3.0. One of them, for example, was trust. What this indicates to me are really two things. First of all, that the constructs related to it, as we talked about, for example, the 4 drivers, they're all related. They all overlap in a little bit. Also, I think I could have, in retrospect, defined my measures a little bit better. I think I tried to get too precise. I had too many definitions for those measures, and that led a little bit to the multicollinearity. Finally, we look at the R-squared. The threshold for the R-squared is being below 0.9. My lowest one, or my highest one, was 0.709, so this established overall model fit. So with this, I felt really good about the analysis that was completed, and I feel really good about the results I achieved. And this is a summary of the results. From the model that I showed earlier, I had 8 hypotheses that I tested. 2 of them, I was not able to reject the null hypothesis. Interestingly enough, those both relate to the extent of use. Everything else played out, and it was proven at a fairly significant level. The extent of use was, in retrospect, perhaps a mistake on my part, introducing extent of use before the results. As a practitioner, I understand that it's a multi-step process, but I'm not sure that that really panned out in the analysis. The final method I used was fuzzy set qualitative content analysis, or FSQCA. I really want to thank one of my cohort members, Dan Nowak, who really persuaded us to talk about this in one of our sessions. I thought it was a fascinating method, and I really enjoyed using it. This is how you graphically show FSQCA as a model. It is a newer method, so I wanted to stop and explain it a little bit. If we think about regression analysis, you're taking a set of independent variables and you're trying to determine how much of an impact each individual variable, independent variable, has on a dependent variable. FSQCA looks at it slightly differently. It looks at all the independent variables, which they just refer to as variables, and it looks for different combinations of those variables that lead to the dependent variable. And they call the dependent variable the outcome. So in this case, we're shifting our terminology from independent variable, dependent variable, just to variables and outcomes. They tend to show the model graphically in a Venn diagram. They also talk about the outcome being high. They're looking for high results, high intent to adopt. So you see those at the top of all 3 models. Those are the 3 outcomes I'm looking for. You see the variables at the bottom of the model. And what they're really trying to display graphically here is you're looking for that sweet spot in the middle of the Venn diagram where there are a combination of variables that lead to the outcome. This is a graphical representation of the process or the method I used. I'm not going to go into each one of the boxes because we'll talk about them on the next slide and the results I achieved. What I wanted to point out here was that I followed the process laid out by Pappas and Woodside. I actually emailed both Pappas and Woodside. They were very charitable. They responded to me. They helped answer my questions, and they validated my results as I went along, which was a really big bonus to me. So just a couple of things laying out the analysis that was done during those steps. The first thing you do with FSQCA is called calibration. Every variable needs to be turned into a value between 0 and 1, and then you set 3 thresholds. In my case, I used 0.95, 0.5, and 0.05. And what you're trying to determine here is a variable included in the outcome? It's either in, it's out, or it's partially in, and you're putting it in 3 categories. Next thing I did was test for necessity. What they're talking about here is a variable required to be in the outcome? If it's absent, the outcome doesn't work. If that's the case, you don't even need to proceed any further. They can say that the variable that you're talking about is necessary and sufficient for the outcome. In my case, all the variables were less than or greater than less than 0.9, meaning I could proceed to the standard analysis. Within the standard analysis, the first thing you do is establish a set of truth tables. This is essentially a set of tables that lays out all the different configurations or recipes that lead to the outcome. You then take those combinations and you test for those specific conditions and ensure that they're consistent and reliable. Next thing you do is test for predictive validity. What you do in this case is you take your sample, you break it up into 2 samples, one you call a holdout sample, one you call a subsample. You run the analysis again, and you look for consistency between the 2 samples and the results. The final thing you do is a contrarian case analysis. In this case, what you're looking for is configurations or recipes that can lead to the outcome that weren't part of the configurations you found. In every one of these cases, the thresholds were met, and I was able to establish the configurations needed for the 3 outcomes. I'll talk a little bit more in more detail about this slide than the next 2. There's basically 1 slide for each of the 3 outcomes. They're each the same. This is how they graphically show the results of an FSQCA outcome. So in this case, we're talking about the high intent to adopt outcome. Along the right-hand side of the chart, you see 2 columns or 2 configurations. These are the 2 configurations that led to a high intent to adopt. Within those rows, you see a couple of different symbols. You'll see a small circle or a large circle. A large circle is a core condition, meaning it's required for that configuration to work. A small circle means that it's a peripheral condition. It enhances the configuration, but it's not as important to the configuration as the core condition, which is required. You also see circles with X's through them, meaning they're absent. And what they mean by that in this case is not just that they're absent, that they can't be present. If they are present, the configuration will not work. Along the bottom, you see measures for consistency and coverage. In this case, for high intent to adopt, we found 4 core conditions: the distributed nature of blockchain technology, the consensus mechanism, and immutability. Those were the 3 important drivers or variables that lead to intent to adopt, along with the absence of a cryptocurrency bias. So this validates what we found in the regression analysis, and it also validates that new construct. It's basically saying that if you're in an organization and you want to pitch, you want to sell the fact that we should be adopting blockchain technology, if there are decision makers that have a cryptocurrency bias, you need to work with them to remediate or eliminate that cryptocurrency bias, or you're not going to achieve an intent to adopt. The other things on this slide that I would point out is there was a high level of consistency and a high level of coverage. So if you look at those configurations, it was very consistent, and it covered a high degree of the cases that led to the outcome. The final thing I'll say on this is if I were talking to a practitioner, how do you relate this from a scholarly or research perspective to them? So as talking to a practitioner, what I would say is, my guidance would be, you need to find a use case if you want your company to adopt blockchain that leverages the distributed nature, the consensus mechanism, and immutability, situations where those are really needed. And that's when blockchain would be most useful. And also, if any of the decision makers have a cryptocurrency bias, you have to talk to them about that first and remediate that. The next 2 outcomes I'll talk a little bit more quickly about. The first one was the high extent of use. This was the one where the regression analysis didn't really validate anything. That's kind of similar in this case. Only 1 configuration showed up. It showed 2 core drivers, the distributed nature and the consensus mechanism. It was, however, it did have high consistency and good coverage. So in this case, a little bit more nuanced or a different way to look at extent to use. If we want to move on to different pilots, if we want to expand the use, I would say from a practitioner perspective, I would say what you want to do is really leverage the distributed nature of blockchain technology and the consensus mechanism. Use cases or reasons to use it that leverage those 2 things. The final one was high level of results. I found this one to be very interesting. We had 3 configurations. We had 3 core configurations or core conditions: the distributed nature, cryptography, and consensus. It was interesting that cryptography at this point or this stage became more important than it was in the previous stages. Again, achieved a high level of consistency and coverage. If I were explaining this to a practitioner, I would say there are 2 different ways to look at it. You need to look for use cases that leverage the distributed nature and cryptography. If cryptography is absent, then you really need to leverage the consensus mechanism. So wrap up, just a quick wrap up of the overall dissertation itself. Discussion, I'd say 2 key things came out of this from my perspective. The first was an understanding that organizations need to take a holistic adoption strategy for blockchain. Each one of the variables contributes at a different level, and in particular, if we're talking about the innovation, diffusion innovation stages, each variable was important at different stages. We noticed that when it came to achieving high levels of results, cryptography became more important. But at the beginning, to get intent to adopt, it wasn't as important of a driver. The second thing I'd note is that cryptocurrency bias is an actual construct. It's real. It was validated. If you're looking to get adoption or intent to adopt within an organization, you have to identify the decision makers that may have a cryptocurrency bias and work with them to eliminate that bias. Limitations. There were a couple limitations that are worth noting. First of all, FSQCA, while it is a great method, it does allow the researcher to make some decisions. You can decide what thresholds to set. You can decide what levels to set for inclusion. In this case, I followed the methodology as closely as possible. I also reached out to Pappas and Woodside, had conversations with them. That's how I attempted to mitigate this limitation. Cultural factors were not addressed. By this, I mean that I only sent my survey out within the United States. Other countries think about cryptocurrencies different than the United States does. So replicating this study in other countries would have different results. Next, I'd note that like any new technology, blockchain is changing rapidly. So if we do the results next year or the year after the survey and we do the research again, may get different results. Finally, I mentioned that the measures could be refined further themselves. Some of the ones overlapped. I think I got too detailed in the measures, so if I were to repeat this again, I would look at those measures a little bit better. And I should have also mentioned cryptocurrency bias. It's really in the early stages. We need to understand it better. More research needs to be done about it. There really is a phenomenon there. It is affecting intent to adopt, but this was the first look at it. Implications for research. The study found that antecedents are important for intent to adopt, especially the distributed nature, the consensus mechanism, and immutability. Negating cryptocurrency bias is extremely important. Cryptocurrency bias needs to be researched more. Biases can change over time. That's something I didn't mention on the previous slide, but a bias is a human characteristic. Over time, the bias towards cryptocurrency may get worse, it may get better, so longitudinal studies in the future could be beneficial. And then also, technologies are changing quickly. Conclusions, contributions. I developed a new research framework that was really the key output from the first essay or the first chapter. I began addressing the gap in the quantitative literature within research by doing the FSQCA and the regression analysis, and I identified a new and novel construct that's important. Learnings, blockchain technology is very complex. There are a lot of factors that lead into organizational intent to adopt. Organizations, from a practitioner standpoint, need to have customized strategies for their organization to achieve intent to adopt. And cryptocurrency biases impact organizational intent to adopt. With it, that's my presentation. I'd open it up now to any questions, and I want to thank everybody for their attention.
Thank you, Steve, for an excellent presentation. So I'll start the questions and hand over the mic to the other committee members. So you talked about the literature review, right? And you had these 45 articles, but you only looked at business articles, correct? I just wanted you to clarify that. Yes.
Yeah, that is an important point, Well, Gene, I should have mentioned that. There are different types of articles, obviously different types of journals that focus on different things. Since I was interested in organizational intent to adopt, I looked at the business articles that were talking about blockchain technology, and I limited my literature review to those articles. There are another set in the computer science journals that focus much more on the technology itself. So you'll find articles, for example, that take deep dives into the storage issue, the technical issue, and how we could resolve that, and what are our different approaches to doing it. I didn't look in any of those journals.
So basically, you excluded all those technical articles for you. So that's why you ended up with just the 45 core set of articles. So yeah, I think that's an important step, right? So what criteria you use to include the articles versus what criteria you use to exclude as well, right? That's going to be important.
Yeah, that's good. And I didn't mention that, but I started by narrowing it down to the business journals, and then I looked at the highest rated business journals. I limited it to the 8 highest journals, and then I did it by the number of citations or references those articles had.
Perfect. So my second question is on the results you found. So you did not find the moderation of crypto bias, right? Moderation effect?
I did find a moderation effect of crypto bias. It wasn't as strong,
As strong
as
as
the direct
direct
impact of
effect. Okay, got
cryptocurrency
it. Okay,
bias.
so just to clarify that. So yeah, that's an important finding, right? Because we find that if crypto bias has a direct influence on intent to adopt, so that means the focus on it should be much more stronger, right, in terms of the organizational set of things. That's a very important finding. Um, so in terms of FSQCA, my question was, is there a minimum sample requirement?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. It's one of the things I really liked about the FSQCA method when I started it. There's a calculator for regression analysis based on the number of constructs you have that tell you what the minimum sample size you need is. With FSQCA, it's reliable with a much smaller sample set. I've seen published articles with samples as low as 20.
Okay.
So in this case, I ran a sample size of just under 200. I was at 197. So I had a very large sample size for FSQCA, but that's one of the benefits of FSQCA. You can do it with a much lower sample size.
So somebody doing a pilot study, so even before they do the full-blown, the actual survey, they could still use FSQCA to understand things.
Yeah,
right? With
absolutely, and that would be a
sample
good
points.
use of FSQCA. And actually, in retrospect, I kind of did it in the order in which I talked about the literature here, but it probably would have been a good idea for me to have started with the FSQCA versus the regression analysis.
Makes sense. Okay, yeah, those are the questions I had, and I'll turn it over to Adi now.
Yeah, good work, Steve.
Thank you.
That was a very crisp presentation. So I have like two questions for you. The first question is, the analysis that you did for your dissertation, you did like multiple ones, right? So which one did you enjoy doing the most?
I actually really enjoyed the FSQCA. I thought it was a very novel approach to things. And from my perspective, it was more intuitive. So I come from a practitioner background, and I think about things much more like that. What combinations of variables lead to the outcome versus regression analysis, which picks, well, how much does each variable contribute to the dependent variable? So to me, FSQCA was much more intuitive, and I really enjoyed working on that method.
And then your findings about crypto bias, like what kind of prediction would you make? Like how long will it take for crypto bias to go away?
That's an interesting question, and I honestly don't have an answer for it. I think this research could merit some longitudinal studies over time to see how that changes. Right now, we're going through the fourth halving event for Bitcoin. It's happening in April, so we're seeing huge price swings with it. And then, within about a year, that price is probably going to dip back down to previous levels. So I'm interested to see if that increases, that price volatility increases cryptocurrency bias more, or if just the fact that it'll be in the news a lot more will start to get people more knowledgeable about cryptocurrency and that it'll be reduced. I would think that initially it's going to lead to more cryptocurrency bias because you're going to see this even huger swing in the price, that more volatility. So especially with decision makers from the finance department, the accounting department, the CFOs, I think that's going to have more of a negative impact. But I really don't have a good answer for it.
Okay. Yeah, that's it. I just had two questions for you.
All right. Steve, really great to see your presentation today. And, I've loved your enthusiasm for FSQCA throughout, and to the extent that you were hosting webinars to, I think, teach colleagues at Green Bay as well as other cohort members here what you've learned about that analytical technique. So, I know I mentioned that at your proposal defense, but I'm just really excited to see the way you've jumped into that analytical technique. Can you I know in your written dissertation you talk about who the sample for your survey is. Can you talk a little bit in terms of, their role within the organization, who that target was?
Yes, that's a good point, and I didn't mention that in the presentation. But I specifically limited the surveys to people who were in the United States, who were working in medium to large-sized organizations, and were within the IT department in leadership roles, decision-making roles. So these would be people that understood blockchain technology, what it was, and they were working with decision makers within their organization to get adoption.
So given that, some of the things that you talked about throughout today's presentation, someone in a CFO role or maybe the accounting, they may especially have more of that cryptocurrency bias, because I think you were talking about the price volatility,
Yes.
whereas the legality or criminality aspects that you mentioned, maybe that's somebody more on a legal,
Legal compliance
department. So if you were to expand your sample, any thoughts in terms of how that might change your results if you had CFOs or somebody from legal departments as
That's
well?
a really good question. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm using leaders or decision makers in the IT department as proxies for the overall organization. I would posit that if we reached out to those decision makers, that the cryptocurrency bias would be even stronger. So, and that's really based from my experience as a practitioner. When I talk to, in particular, people in finance and accounting departments, they wanted nothing to do with blockchain technology. They had a very immediate, very strong reaction that, yeah, that's interesting. I think about that a lot. I want nothing to do with it. This whole cryptocurrency market, it's going to collapse, it's going to go away, and we can't have anything to do with something that relates to that. So I think the findings, if anything, are lower in my research because of the proxy that I used.
So one final question, thinking for fellow cohort members, future cohort members, any tips, advice that you would share, especially in terms of FSQCA, in terms of recommendations of if they're thinking about potentially using it, where you see value or maybe less value?
Yeah, when we did the research and we conducted the session where we talked about the method in the DBA program, it was really most popular among IT research and marketing research. So if you're doing research in either of those two areas, I'd highly encourage DBA students to look at that as a method or adding it as a second method to enhance your results.
Great. And again, great job today.
Thank you.
Any questions from the audience? Praveen or Matt? Okay, I can't even turn now. So, all right, I think we are good.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate it.